Well, I'm delighted to welcome you all back, if this is your second time in this series, Digging Deeper in Lockdown. The title today is 10 Biblical Manuscripts You Should Know. And I'm going to be dividing this into three sections. The first part is going to be giving you a glossary and some key terms which we'll need when we're discussing this subject. Then I'll go through the 10 manuscripts and give you a little at least one point of relevance for each one of them. Thirdly, we're going to talk about the relevance of them. So in terms of by the way, this is part of a series on the Bible and archaeology. One of my slogans for these tours is, if you are interested in the Bible and you like learning, you'll love the tours. And I hope that's the case for you if you're with us today. Especially for the first time. Now, clearing the decks and giving you some terms. First of all, manuscript. What is a manuscript? When's the last time you saw one? You're probably thinking about, perhaps Lord of the Rings, searching through dusty old libraries. Does the manuscript just mean proof? We've got the manuscript, means we've got the proof. Well, manuscript simply means written by hand. And so anything, I mean, this is some manuscript you might be able to see here. This is just me writing on the back of, in fact, what is a piece of papyrus, and that was going to be my second question, which is what is papyrus? So papyrus is basically old-fashioned paper. It's where we get the word paper from. Here is some. Don't know if you can see, it's quite sort of grainy there, and I've got a picture somewhere here of a papyrus plant. This was in the Botanical Gardens in Oxford. So here we go. There we are. So that's a papyrus plant. It's rather pretty. Papyrus is vegetable matter. It tends to rot, especially when it's damp. Vellum is the other thing that manuscripts are written on, which is skin, animal skin, and otherwise known as parchment. Interestingly, the Acts of Parliament of the UK have been written for many years on animal skin because we know it lasts. Definitely sounds old-fashioned, but that's how it's done. Now, other terminology, the autograph. The autograph just means the original. So in the case of the Apostle Paul, for example, writing, say, Philippians from prison, it'll be the letter which perhaps has a circular stain from where he put his coffee mug in one corner of it, for example, Paul himself, or perhaps where there are, salt watermarks from where he says in chapter 3 that he sheds tears over those who live as enemies of the cross of Christ, whose God is their stomach and whose glory is in their shame. So those tears, this is the original. Now, we don't have the originals of any of the biblical manuscripts, but what we do have is the manuscripts, and the study of the manuscripts helps us to know with certainty that what we have is what was originally written down by those early writers. So other points to mention, just a couple of other points in terms of clearing the decks. If a document has a P number, that's a papyrus. So we're going to look at a couple of P numbers today of what those are. And MS, if you come across that, just means manuscript, or MSS means manuscripts in the plural. Last thing to mention is what is a codex? Codex just means a book. So plural is codices, like index, indices, matrix, matrices. So the word codex will come up once or twice. And of course, the predecessor of the codex, or the book for the Bible, can you think what that was? Right, that's scrolls. So things wrapped around a central stick, and then you roll them out one way or the other to go forwards and backwards. And that was what we had before we had the book. Now, let's now go through what these 10 manuscripts are. Now, I'm doing this in reverse order just to build the excitement. So we'll start with number 10 and end with number 1. This isn't particularly in order of priority. It's roughly chronological, but with one exception. And but basically it's going back in time. So we're going to start with the most recent. Don't worry, by the way, there will be a list at the end of what these are. So you can just enjoy listening for now. Jot if you want to, but I'll give you the list at the end. Number 10 is the Lindisfarne Gospels. Lindisfarne is an island off the coast of Northumbria in England. It was sometimes called Holy Island, and that area of England was I'd say it's just the most prestigious place for Christianity and for manuscript production in the 8th century, in the Saxon era. This was just shortly before the Vikings turned up on the scene and spoilt the party. But this was a wonderful time. And what's the significance of the Lindisfarne Gospels? Well, these are manuscripts, so written by a monk by hand in 715. What's the significance? Actually, it's just that they're pretty. No, you didn't miss here. That's the significance. I think they are a wonderful work of art, lovely illustrations. Some of the animals of Northumberland and the birds, cormorants, seem to make their way into some of the illustration. And if you want to know more about the relevance of the Lindisfarne Gospels for the translation of the Bible, then please come on my tour to the British Library and I will tell you more. And that's, by the way, where you should go if you want to see the Lindisfarne Gospels. And as the name suggests, they comprise the Gospels. Now, that's number 10. Number 9, Codex Alexandrinus. Now, codex, remember that word? So it's a book. It's called Alexandrinus because it comes from Alexandria, which is one of the 3 largest cities in the Roman world at the time of Jesus and the early church. Alexandria, named after, you guessed it, Alexander. A popular name. It popped up in last week's webinar with Alexander the sausage seller. So this is from the 5th century, so the 400s. And it's a copy of the whole Bible, and this was a gift from the Patriarch of Constantinople to James I of England, James VI of Scotland. Why a patriarch of anywhere should be making presents to the Catholic, now Protestant kings of England? Again, another story. Come on the British Library tour and I'll tell you more. And where is that? That's, again, at the British Library, because the court of James I or Charles I, James had died when the document arrived. Eventually, the Royal Library was given to the British Museum, and that part is now with the British Library. So that's number 9. What's the significance? It's the complete Bible from the 5th century. So if someone says, oh, we don't have any copies of the Bible any earlier than 1200, 1400, they just don't know what they're talking about. And they certainly haven't been to St. Pancras Station, or more importantly, the library next to it, the John Ripblatt Gallery, which is where, if you go today, you'll find the Codex Alexandrinus. Now, number 8 is Codex Sinaiticus. So this is like the top 3. So Vaticanus, Alexandrinus, and Sinaiticus are the 3 most famous biblical manuscripts in the world. 2 of them are in the British Library. That's Alexandrinus and Sinaiticus, and Vaticanus, as the name suggests, is in the Vatican. So 2 of the 3 are in London. Sinaiticus and Vaticanus are basically the peer documents, very similar age, format. Again, if you want to know more of the detail and the wonderful story of how they were, of how Sinaiticus was found, you guessed it, come on my British Library tour and you'll find out more. Significance of Sinaiticus is that it's a century older than Alexandrinus. So we're now into the early 4th century, so the early 300s, and we've got a complete copy of the Bible. It's written on skin, on vellum. It's therefore more like a deluxe edition, from the time when Christianity had got a newfound champion in Constantine, who had conquered in the name of and in the symbol of Christ. So that's Sinaiticus. That's my number 8. Now, number 7 is the Oxyrhynchus papyri. Now, crumbs, what is this? Oxyrhynchus, spelling needs a bit of a run-up. Oxyrhynchus. If that's too difficult, then you might know the city by its other name, the city of the sharp-nosed fish. No, it doesn't ring any bells? No, well, there we are. So it doesn't make much more sense to me either. Anyway, the Oxyrhynchus papyri are a collection of papyri in the city rubbish tip. There are documents in the tip from the 200s, 300s, 400s. Where are they now? They're in England. There's a little bit of a repeated story here. They're actually in Oxford. And they contain all sorts of things. What's significant about the Oxyrhynchus papyri is that they are unofficial. So these are not the production of the official church. This is quite the opposite. These are things that were discarded and never intended to be seen again. Among the Oxyrhynchus papyri, most of them, by the way, have got nothing to do with Christianity or the Bible. They're just whatever you find in your rubbish. But among them, there happens to be there's a warrant for the arrest of a Christian. So this is a reminder that before that watershed moment of 313 and Constantine, Christianity lurched from being acceptable to being persecuted, but was not officially recognized. But there were periods of persecution in those first 250 or so years of the church. Or 300 years. But the other thing among the Oxyrhynchus papyri is there is a fragment which is I've seen in the British Library, a fragment of Hebrews chapter 2, but that is not written on skin. That's written on papyrus, and it looks very different, as you'll see in a minute. So there's the Oxyrhynchus papyri. That's a fragment of Hebrews chapter 2 copied out onto the back of something else. So this is a time when it wasn't cool. It was actually dangerous to be a follower of Jesus. It was subversive, and sometimes you'd have to copy out manuscripts by hand. Imagine that. If you wanted a Bible, you couldn't go to the store. There wasn't a Bible store in the city of the sharp-nosed fish. No, you had to find one, buy some papyrus, or find some discarded papyrus somewhere else, take it, and then copy out your copy of the Bible. And that was the only way you could read personally. Otherwise, you would rely on attending a gathering of Christians and listening to Paul's letters, Hebrews, or the Gospel being read out. So the Ethiopian eunuch was very unusual, and you'll appreciate, in having his own copy of the scriptures to read in Acts chapter 8. Sometimes the more we have of something, the less we appreciate it. These early Christians had to copy their own scriptures in order to be able to read them. That's number 7. Now, number 6, the Chester Beatty Papyri. Great name. And for the first time, these aren't in England. They're all the wrong way away in Dublin, in Ireland. So actually not that far. So significance for these, first of all, they're papyri, and you'll see in a moment what papyri looked like when they've been when they're 2,000 years old. So, but among them are the Chester Beatty papyri. There's a complete set of the Gospels and the Book of Acts. And you say, what's the date of that? The date of that, do you remember Codex Sinaiticus, around 325 AD? These are from 200 to 250. And if you want to know what they look like, I've got some of this is some copies of some of the Chester Beatty papyri. These are actually some of the Old Testament manuscripts. Hopefully you can see these. They are, I mean, what distinguishes them is they're rather, scrappy looking. I mean, and that's very different from what you see with proper, with a skin document. So we're talking papyri, and we're talking Gospels from 200 to 250. Now, number 5, we're now going back. So, well, is that the best we can do? No, if you're going to say we don't want complete copies of things, but actually, if you take into account fragments like these, then have we got fragments of Gospels from earlier? The answer is absolutely yes. Now, number 5, we're moving into the top half of the table here. Number 5, is I want to tell you about the Jesus Papyrus, sometimes known as the Magdalen Papyrus, or in technical terms, P64. Here we are, there we go. So in Magdalen College, Oxford. That's the Magdalen College Tower, taken in the snow, so not actually taken recently. But now look at the age of this. Now we've gone back before the 200s. This has been dated to 170 AD, and this is the oldest bit of Matthew that we have, Matthew's Gospel. Again, this is written in Greek, and here are the fragments, and you can see there's sort of a mirror image going on, a bit like you saw with I think the first page I showed you of that Chester Beatty document. So this is papyrus written on both sides, cheaper that way. And now what's it actually got in it? These are fragments of Matthew 26, and it's the scene where a woman pours oil on Jesus's or perfume on Jesus's head, traditionally associated with Mary Magdalene. Hence, it's appropriate that Magdalen College has this. But what's significant for me as a believer, who I'm grateful for what Jesus did for me. I'm grateful and in admiration of the early apostles. I love their humanity, their ordinariness, and this is the first time that we know of. This is the earliest recording of the following words. So the word Judas Iscariot is in those documents you can see there. The 12, Judas was still one of them. Peter is in there. The phrase "I'll go ahead of you into Galilee" is there, and the word Jesus. Hence this being known sometimes as the Jesus Papyrus, because it's the oldest document that we have with the name Jesus in, referring to our Saviour, our friend, even our brother, as he dared to call us after he was raised from the dead, Jesus. So that's the Magdalen Papyrus. By the way, you might be wondering, how do we know the ages of these things? Do you test the age of the papyrus, or what? Actually, no, that doesn't get close enough for these purposes. What you do is by looking at letter formation, because writing evolves. And the example I normally give when I do my tour in the British Library is of newspapers. If I gave you a newspaper, an English newspaper from 1950, 1980, and 2000, even if I had the same sentence, which is something like Parliament met today. I mean, just from the letter formation used in the different fonts of the typeset, you could tell. And when you get into type, things are much more standardized than they are with writing. So it's all about letter formation. But if I gave you those three letters, those three newspapers, I'm sure you could put them in the right order of which was the older and which is the most recent. So now that is number 5. Now number 4, we're getting old now. You say, what is the very oldest manuscript of any part of the New Testament that we have? Well, the answer to that is it is a little bit of John chapter 18. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead here. John chapter 18, and that's the John Rylands fragment. And that is the oldest part of any bit of the New Testament, and that is in Manchester. Guess what? In England yet again. I was asked in I had a question. Why is it the English have got all these? Well, my son asked the same thing. Arguably, it's because the British appreciated their value before some other countries. That's a slightly evasive argument, but there is some truth in it. You may know how the Codex Sinaiticus came to be in the possession of the British Library, and that's because a newly communist government in Russia in 1933 saw no real need to keep copies of an old discredited Bible, and so they sold it. not too long before that, I think they'd also had some land they wanted to sell. It won't surprise you to know that the Americans paid for or bought the land, which had oil underneath, and the British couldn't wait for £100,000 to get their hands on a lovely old Bible, Codex Sinaiticus, and that's how it comes to be where it is now. So anyway, that's number 4. And the significance of this is its age. I mean, just think for a moment. This is from 125 AD, this fragment of John 18. Now, if you're the scribe and you're copying it out, I just want you to travel with me for a moment. Possibly it's in Egypt, that's where this was found. So you've got a scribe in Egypt and they're copying out, they're writing out this thing that's now in Manchester. Now, what are they copying from? I mean, what have they got next to them? I mean, it couldn't be John's actual gospel, could it? Well, John's gospel is written probably last of all the gospels, around, towards the end of the 1st century, maybe 70. But isn't it ironic that the last written of the gospels provides us with the earliest fragment of a New Testament document? And what's the gap? Possibly as little as 50 years. I mean, that's in my lifetime. So was it John's gospel, or was it a copy that was made from the original of John's gospel? I mean, this is extraordinary that we're so close in time to the original. And if you want to compare this, by the way, to other documents from antiquity, Caesar's Gallic Wars, which I know I translated from Latin when I was at school. So written by Julius Caesar, it's supposed, therefore it's got a BC date. The oldest copy in existence of Caesar's Gallic Wars is from about 800 years after it was written. No one says, oh, well, it was obviously changed a lot. No, there's no reason to doubt that what we have now is similar. It was clearly a copy of a copy of a copy going back, but we've got it from the 800 AD, 800-year gap. So it's similar if you talk about Tacitus' histories. It's at least 800 years gap between when Tacitus wrote and the oldest copy we've got. No one doubts that when they're reading it, that this is anything other than what Tacitus wrote. There's an even bigger gap of about 1300 years with Herodotus and Thucydides. So if we're not going to doubt those, then how can you doubt, in the case of John's Gospel, that what we have is actually what John originally wrote? And we'll come on to talk about a bit more about John later on. Now we're down to our last 3. So what are these going to be? Surely there aren't anymore, because we've got as old as we can. No, we're now going to go back to the Old Testament. So number 3 is the Discoveries in the Judean Desert, volume 46. Now, from your blank look, perhaps you haven't heard of this. I admit it wasn't a blockbuster bestseller in last year's Christmas gifts or the one before, but actually that's not surprising, because what is its meaning? The answer is absolutely none, by definition. If that sounds puzzling, let me explain. This is because what's been published in volume 46 is all the bits left over from the Dead Sea Scrolls that have got no meaning. And the reason for this is there was a conspiracy for a long time that was believed to have happened with the Dead Sea Scrolls, that somehow the full extent of their content was being kept back by the Catholic Church, and was somehow there was some evidence in there that discredited the whole of Christianity. And because of this conspiracy, it was felt that we need to publish everything. I mean, even the bits that have got no meaning. So that was an extraordinary document, but it is worth mentioning. Now, number 2 is one of those Dead Sea Scrolls that actually did have a huge amount of meaning. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found in 1947, not that long ago, and they were an extraordinary find. It came about when a stone was thrown into a cave by a shepherd. There was some sort of noise of a breaking jar, or it popped and hit a jar in there. Further investigations, and suddenly cave after cave was found containing jars with all these ancient documents in. Well, how old were they? Well, they were all from before the Jewish War, 66 to 73 AD, but there were copies of virtually all of the Old Testament scriptures and lots of other internal documents of the community. Now, what does it look like when you go to Qumran? Let me find my picture here. I was privileged to get a chance to go there. Here we are. So I think you can just see that is very dry. There's not much greenery around there. In the background is one of the most difficult places for anything to grow or live. That is the Dead Sea, hence the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's the lowest place on the surface of the earth, a long way below sea level. And those are some friends of mine. You can just see the sea in the background. So that's the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, the other thing I want to show you here, just a moment, is here's a stone I picked up, because remember there was a shepherd boy threw a stone in. So here we are. Here's my stone. Looks a bit like the Isle of Wight, diamond shape, or Singapore if you're from that part of the world. Because I like to collect stones, I also have to write on them so I don't forget which is which. So that's got Qumra on. So they had lots of other stones. I don't think they'll miss that one. Now, among these, among the Dead Sea Scrolls, was of particular significance was the Great Isaiah Scroll. Now, this was an incredible document, more than 7 meters long, and you can actually see it today if you want to. This one, though, is not in England. So this is firmly protected by the State of Israel. And you can see it in the Shrine of the Book Museum, where it's got pride of place. And this was an incredibly significant document for them, because this, the earliest copy of Isaiah in Hebrew was from around 900 AD. There was no earlier copy in Hebrew of Isaiah. So among the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found one that was from 100 BC. That's not the date Isaiah was around. That was the date the copy was written out of Isaiah, and it was a single scroll, and with 66 chapters in, all of them there. Not the chapter numbers, of course; those were added later. But the whole thing is there, and in the middle of it is that amazing chapter Isaiah 53, which I'll read from in a minute. But just look where it is. That's the museum is designed to look a bit like the lid of a jar, and inside, in pride of place, you can see there with what looks like a huge scroll handle. That's the Isaiah scroll, wrapped in a long strip all around that central column for you to walk around and read it. It's all very carefully temperature controlled, of course. And it's in Hebrew. So this is a very exciting find for Israel, and that's where it is if you want to go and see it. So now, why have I put that down? Well, it's clearly a biblical manuscript, but what's its significance? Well, in the middle of it is Isaiah 53, and I'd like to read from this, if I may. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led out to slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. And they made his grave with the wicked, crucified between robbers, and with a rich man in his death, Joseph of Arimathea, although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth, according to Pontius Pilate. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. This is extraordinary on so many levels. It's extraordinary, the resemblance between this suffering servant and Jesus. It's so close that people wanted to suggest this is one of those things that the early Christians sort of fabricated and wrote back into some copy of Isaiah, which became the common one nowadays. Think about it. If we have now discovered in 1947 a copy of Isaiah 53 that's from 100 BC, this was in existence before Jesus was born, let alone before his crucifixion. But more than this, think about the theology here. People say, oh, well, Jesus dying for our sins. I think he just sort of died. He upped it, you know, he got on the wrong side of the Romans. He's a great example of, you know, suffering, good martyr, you know, Martin Luther King or something like that. You know, the guy who suffered a lot. Paul says, 1 Corinthians 15, many other places, Jesus died for our sins. So that's very much a Pauline sort of idea. No, Paul was just going back to Isaiah. Isaiah had said, and this is bizarre, you've got a situation where normally God blesses the righteous and punishes the wicked. Here you've suddenly got God is crushing one who has done no violence. It was the Lord's will to crush this innocent person. That shouldn't even be in the Old Testament. It's so out of character. Why crush someone who has done no wrong? Well, it's because Isaiah was inspired to write this. He was given this extraordinary prophecy about Jesus. And it's ironic that a prophecy which is so important for the Jewish people should have pride of place in the middle of Jerusalem as a great witness to Jesus. Now, we've come now to our last item, and that is going to be a bit of sand, number one. Bit of sand, which is the only bit of writing that we know Jesus did. I think it's in John chapter 8, the woman caught in adultery, John 12. Anyway, so he writes in the sand. It says, that tells us not just that Jesus is literate, that's fine, but it reminds us that Jesus left no writings. People today like to say, oh, Jesus, he was a great teacher. You know, what sort of teacher? I mean, this is instinctive, and those of you who are teachers know this. It's instinctive. You want to record stuff. You want to put stuff out there. You want to record webinars. That's your instinct. If Jesus is this great teacher who's come to give some great ideas, he should be writing it all down. Instead of that, he sort of chances it with a group of, you know, tradesmen from Galilee. Could Jesus have written things down? I think he could have done. You might say, well, papyrus is a bit expensive. Jesus had some wealthy friends. He was supported, the Bible says, by members of Herod's household, Martha, Mary, Lazarus. They're very well-to-do people. So there's no doubt that it could have been recorded had Jesus wanted that. But I think that probably these aren't written down because he doesn't want it to be a distraction, because his reason for coming was not to be the teacher. He came to be that sheep in Isaiah 53, to give his life as a ransom for many. And that's not something you can write down in a book. You have to give your life. And that was Jesus giving of himself for us, his body and his blood. We've now completed all 10. And I'll give you the list before we finish, so you can look at them again. But let me just ask you now about the relevance of what we talked about. What's the relevance? Well, try and answer this with a true or false. First of all, is this statement true or false? We don't have any manuscripts older than from the Middle Ages. That's clearly false. The so-called Old Testament prophecies about Jesus were doctored by the early Christians. No, you can't say that since 1947 anyway, in relation to Isaiah 53. The New Testament is one of the worst attested documents to come down to us from antiquity. That's just so far-fetched. It doesn't even merit an answer, but that's false. So, those of you who will know, who came on the previous webinar, I really want to talk about for biblical archaeology its value because of its witness to truth and its relevance. So let's talk about why the study of the manuscripts is relevant. It doesn't prove that what the original people wrote or said was necessarily true, but the manuscripts give us confidence that we have what was originally written, and that removes one big obstacle to belief. Why is this relevant? Well, let me give you one verse. I said I'd mention John again, which is featured a couple of times, the last gospel and the oldest fragment that we have. John 3:16, it's one of the best known verses in the Bible. It says, Jesus says, God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believed in him would not perish, but have eternal life. This is a promise from the lips of Jesus. Did Jesus really say it? We know now he did say it, because that is the evidence of the manuscripts. But is it true? Well, this is the all-important question, isn't it? So, well, is it relevant? Is there a God? Does God love the world? I mean, don't tell me those things aren't relevant. I believe there is a God, and I believe that he loves the world. But whether or not that promise came from the lips of Jesus, we now know beyond doubt is the case. Studying the manuscripts helps us make sure that we have what was originally written. Next week, we're going to look at the ways archaeology can illuminate and confirm the biblical accounts, looking at one particular group, the Assyrians. Now, if you want some background reading, which I'd recommend you do for this, then I will get it for you here up on the screen. Then it's 2 Kings. Here we are. There's our summary, first of all, and I'll add this to the email I'm sending out shortly. So there they are. Those are the 10 in reverse order. I hope that's helpful. These aren't the only biblical manuscripts, of course. There are many, many others, but these are the 10 top ones I think it's worth you knowing about. This is for next week. There's the background reading. Book of Jonah, of course, you could read as well. But Book of Nahum, which I doubt you've picked up that often, but this is all about Assyria and those chapters of 2 Kings, 17, 18, and 19. So it only remains for me to say thank you for joining us. I do have a couple of extra things here that I put together. So people say, what do we do about extra reading? There we are. There's a couple of books about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Giza Vermesh on the left. I've met him, another Oxford scholar. He wrote a famous book called Jesus the Jew in the 60s, which was very groundbreaking at the time. And Herschel Shanks, he's the editor of Biblical Archaeology Review, or was. And at the top, there's a picture of my little stone. Here are people asked last week about where to go to find out more about biblical archaeology. Well, here are some ideas. First of all, children's books. To be honest, I think they're great on a whole lot of subjects. Russian history, why not get a children's book? I mean, they're great introductions nowadays, very good quality, good illustrations. There you can see on the top right, the Bible in the British Museum. That's the rather stodgy, I'm afraid, book by T.C. Mitchell, but that was the first one to come out. And then there's a rather more accessible one in the middle. And if you're only going to get one book, this is the one I would get. through the British Museum with the Bible, now in its 5th edition. That's the book I wish I'd written. Bottom right, Alan Millard, fantastic. I got this knockdown price, £5. If you can get a copy anywhere, do. It's fantastic. Alan Millard is alive. I've been on one of his tours. He's actively involved in a church in the Midlands somewhere, but he's a very well-respected figure in the British Museum, and is the only person I've ever met who can actually read cuneiform. More on that next week. Bargle Pixner, he's a monk. I really enjoyed reading that. His theory is that the land of Israel is like the 5th gospel. It's that extra dimension, that extra guy rope on the stories. And Biblical Archaeology Review, really recommend that. It's got a range of contributors, some of them Bible believers, ranging through to biblical minimalists, but really interesting. And if I ever want to treat, and I can't think of what to get for my birthday, I say to my family, "Oh, just get me the latest copy of Biblical Archaeology Review." And what's next? Here we are, a few things just on the subject of manuscripts on their own. A few books there. That's one about the Magdalen Papyrus. So that's it. I just want to say thank you very much for joining me today, and I hope you've got a lot out of it. Thank you.